children ought not to wander in the light of the crimson moon. For it's in the gloam of the sanguine sky that the hounds of hell roam the shadows, hunting for innocent and lost souls on which to feast their fetid maws. Mother often spoke that ominous warning to my brother, Kalen, when we were growing up. Even though it sent a chill down my spine to hear the words, I never really knew what she meant by it. Every few years, when the time of the red skies came, there were never any signs of skulking demonic beasts seeking to scoop us up. On the contrary, Mother and Father held fantastic parties. Several of the grown-ups from our church would come, dressed in the finest suits and the most beautiful gowns. They would dance and sing, laugh and drink brandy. Nasty stuffed brandy. A boy from our church dared me to drink a sip a few years back, and I spat it out almost immediately. This year it was decided that Kalen was too big for Mother to carry around all night. As such, he became my responsibility. I was to watch him and take care of him, while the grown-ups attended the party. The night drawled onwards, music ringing out from the parlour and filling the house with an air of otherworldly enchantment. My brother and I, along with 4 other children, stayed in the basement and entertained ourselves with games and told rhymes around Kalen's zoetrope. It was around 3 hours past midnight when the garnet moon was painting the sky into its deepest burning shades that we all began to separate and grow tired of each other's company. Kalen and I had gone off by ourselves to a secret play area we'd previously established in the storeroom by the kitchen. Here I idly toyed with my collection of marbles while Kalen watched absent-mindedly from atop a wooden crate in front of the lone, plain window. Windows were in every way off-limits during the cycle of the red moon. The more public rooms of our home were blocked off with lovely silken sheets that mimicked the hues of the sky outside. Under no circumstances was one to even catch a glimpse of the night outside. This was another rule that I never fully understood and saw no real harm in letting my puerile sibling violate. And so, I resolved to share a special moment of secret rebellion with Kalen, where we could peek out at the vermilion horizon and take in sights we were never meant to see. "Papi!" Kalen cooed excitedly, and suddenly startling me out of the near-hypnotic allure of the city beyond our window. I quickly scanned the area for the pup that had drawn my young sibling's attention, but saw nothing. I assumed he'd spied one of the wild mutts that occasionally wander into town after dark in search of food. I excused myself to the restroom after trying in vain to coerce the 4-year-old to accompany me. How much trouble can one toddler get into inside a small pantry? I convinced myself, and with that, I made my way out down the hall to relieve myself. It was only while washing up after that a strange sense of creeping anxiety took a hold of me. I quickly made my way back to the pantry, telling myself along the way that I'd had enough of tonight's celebration, and it was high time Kalen and I had gone to bed. When I opened the door to the pantry, my heart plummeted and sent waves of cold terror coursing through me. Kalen was precisely where I'd left him, standing on the old crate, gazing out through the window, which was now raised to its fully open position. But it was what stood beyond the window, gazing back at him, that had stolen my senses and frozen me in an icy panic. Just outside the wide portal lurched a massive beast. It was covered in matted, greasy black fur, and its long, snouted face resembled that of a hound or a wolf. The window stood around 2 meters up from the floor, and was itself around that height. The dog-like thing slouched severely on its hind legs, and must have stood more than 4 meters tall when fully upright. The thing's long, sinewy forelimbs hung down, and seemed to almost reach the ground. Worst of all were the beast's eyes. Milky grey and seemingly long dead, they stared vacuously at my brother. The thing seemed to sway softly as it eyed Kalen, and to my horror its drooling, filthy maw had twisted into what I could only describe as a sick, malicious grin. I stared, paralyzed in pure terror, for what seemed like hours. Before I knew it, however, reality caught up with me in a crashing, torrential tidal wave of pure terror. With a blinding speed, the thing snapped forward and caught Kalen between his small neck and shoulders with its massive jaws and ripped him through the window and out into the night. Shaken from my delirium, I raced to save him, but could not cross the distance in time. In an instant, the small, screaming child and his hulking, bestial captor had disappeared into the dense alleyways beyond our house. I choked out a sob for my brother. He was my responsibility, and I'd failed him. An inferno of pure hatred for the thing, and for my own failures, burned through my veins. Riding the adrenaline high, I raced blindly through the house. Before I'd fully realized my actions, I found myself marching out of my parents' master bedroom, father's flintlock in hand. It was when I passed the parlor on my way back to the window, where that thing had stolen my brother, that I paused. I'd heard Mother's inebriated laughter sounding out among the sounds of music, as well as the dull roar of her guests. I sighed solemnly. The adults would be of no help. Most of them that I could see could barely stand, let alone track a beast through the winding streets of town. If they even believed me to begin with, that is. Setting my jaw, I continued back to the pantry and, after only a moment's hesitation, climbed out of the window and into the cobblestone alley beyond. Looking around, I shuddered. The sound of my footsteps reverberating off of the cold stone wall sent anxiety's cold fingers tickling up my spine. I saw, to my dismay, a well-defined trail of Kalen's blood spattering off into the distance. My grip on the pistol tightened, and I followed the dog-like thing's trail. I would get my brother back, I thought, and if not, I would kill the abomination that took him from me. Even if doing it, and more so doing it alone, meant that I might not come back. The twisting alleys and paths of the town felt ever more labyrinthian in the ruby glow of that sickeningly sinister blood moon. Shadows loomed long, threatening to swallow me into their outstretched grasp. With every sharp angle, my heart beat faster, anticipating that horrid mongrel beast to leap out and claim me like it had Kalen. My spine went rigid, and my blood turned to ice as a long, discordant sound rang out and echoed over the rooftops. It took me a moment to recognize it as a kind of unholy amalgam of a scream and a bestial howl. It had to be the thing that had taken Kalen. Taking a deep breath, I set out at a light jog, determined to find the horror before it crawled back into whatever fetid pit it had come from. I trotted up the stone steps to the town's main square. As I came to the top, I got my wish, and dear God, how I wish I hadn't. The dog-like thing was there, its back to me. I could see the sickly, mangy flesh running up its spine. Hair, or I suppose fur, clustered itself in matted bunches and glinted wet in the red lunar light. I could see now that its legs were as unnaturally long as its arms had been when I'd first laid eyes on it. It was hunched over someone, and its gangling limbs lurched out at awkward angles so as to bring its face low. I steeled myself and crept slowly toward the feasting creature, raising Father's flintlock level to my eye and aimed directly at the beast's center mass. As I neared, the thing seemed to jerk its canine face to the side, letting out a kind of mucusy hacking, as if some thick ichor were caught in its throat. With its head pulled away, I could see just who it had been gorging itself on. Kalen's pale face, frozen in a mix of agony and horror, gazed at me from beneath the crouching giant. Blood vessels in his right eye had broken, giving it a bulging black look in the shadows. His face bore monstrous gashes down one side, and his silvery blonde hair was caked in gore. Below the neck, it was hardly possible to distinguish as a body. Viscera and half-chewed organs lay in a loose pile. A pool of my baby brother's blood had seeped into the cracks of the cobblestone and began to spread in awkward geometric patterns. I let out a sharp gasp at the sight of Kalen's mutilation. Immediately, the greasy, dog-like creature's long ears perked up, and its head snapped impossibly fast to face me. The creature's maw curled into that same sickening grin I'd seen before it had taken Kalen, and its body slowly shifted in my direction. From deep within its throat, a guttural, almost chuckling sound crept out and wove tendrils of chilling fear throughout my being. I cocked the hammer of Father's flintlock and desperately tried to steady my tremorous hands. The dog-like beast reared up on its hind legs and stood to its full height, its spine and joints letting out a stomach-churning series of cracks and snaps. It turned its head to gaze at the crimson moon and inhaled deeply, the pustule-ridden, greasy skin of its underbelly expanding and splitting in places as it filled its lungs. The thing returned its gaze to my frozen form and unleashed a terrible roar, whose sound was only made worse by the reverberations off of the stone walls and pathways of the square. The sound wormed its way deep inside my skull, threatening to shred my eardrums with the same voracity and savagery that the beast itself had torn into Kalen. I felt a wave of dizziness and a queer sense of nausea while the thing howled its nightmarish cry. Before I knew it, my legs had gone limp and the earth quickly rose up to meet my fainting body. The shadows rushed in from the corners of my vision to claim me. I used every bit of strength I could muster to squeeze the trigger of the pistol, sending a shot, lightning fast, into the monster's shoulder and causing it to shriek in pain. The ringing echo of the gunshot, mixed with the dog-like bellows, fused awkwardly together and faded out in time with my steadily receding consciousness. The morning after was, for the most part, a haze. A constable woke me and returned me to my home, where I was examined by our family physician. The news of Kalen's death was broken to mother and father, who collapsed at the loss of their son. I told my mother my story of how the dog-like thing had taken Kalen and how I had gone to rescue him. She only cried harder and cursed my idiocy. I tried for nearly a quarter of an hour to get any information on just what the beast was and why it had taken my brother. I also couldn't comprehend just why nobody was talking about the mangled, horrible state his body had been left in. It was as if nobody cared, or at the very least weren't surprised by it. She never faltered, however. She never spoke a word. It was at Kalen's funeral that things began to feel more real, and less like the wispy fog of confusion that arises when trying to recall a dream. The family was gathered closest to the coffin as Kalen was lowered into the ground. Nearest us were our close friends and members of our church. I remembered peeking around during the final prayer and seeing someone peculiar standing off in the distance, beneath a gnarled oak tree. We made eye contact, and he seemed to acknowledge me in a way, as if to express his condolences. The man beneath the tree was the former reverend of our church. I didn't know much about him, as Mother said he'd been excommunicated nearly 16 years prior. She never explained the reason for his removal, just that he was an unclean soul and not fit to lead a congregation as tight-knit and devout as that of our church. Reverend Dutoit had become something of a local boogeyman in the time since his separation from the church. Children passed stories around that if you misbehaved or wandered into the streets at night, that Dutoit would snatch you up and take you back to his estate on the hill overlooking town. Rumors could occasionally be heard that he'd bought strange herbs and ingredients from the town apothecary and conducted strange experiments deep in the bowels of his home, but nobody could ever say for sure that this was the case. It was always an instance a friend of a friend of a friend told me. Seeing Dutoit at a funeral wasn't particularly odd, especially given that he'd known my parents during his tenure at the church. One thought did strike me as peculiar, however, and it teased the corners of my thoughts during our return home. It nagged at me just enough that, before the sun had begun to set in the amber evening sky, I had again climbed through my window and crept my way through town. As I stood at the base of the hill, atop which Dutoit's decrepit old estate rested, eyeing the torn, twisted state of the front gate, I was only more certain of my suspicions. When I'd eyed the aged man at the cemetery, his right arm and shoulder had been wrapped in a sling. the same arm that I'd shot the beast in. As if to cement my growing hunch further, the bandage fabric was noticeably stained a deep red tinge. Of course. That's why he'd been removed from the church and why the townspeople vilified him. That's what Mother meant when she called him unclean. Dutoit was the dog-like thing that took my brother away from me. Whatever rituals he practiced, whatever experiments he was attempting, I would make him face justice for what he'd done. I would confront him. Reverend Dutoit's home bore an even stronger sense of disrepair upon closer inspection. The stonework was moss-ridden and cracked. The wood of the front porch appeared dry and skeletal, as though it could crumble to dust and ash at any moment. The windows, however, were fitted with thick iron bars that felt starkly dissimilar to the rest of the ancient structure. I circled the outside, wanting to ensure an inconspicuous point of entry in order to catch the vile man-beast off guard. As luck would have it, a small, almost child-sized window in the structure's basement stuck out around the back of the house and was unguarded by the thick wrought iron of the other portholes. Sharp, weedy grass poked and cut at my arms as I tried to force the window open. Despite my pulling, however, the glass would not come free. In frustration, I struck out at the window pane, resolving to shatter it and forego my element of surprise. To my horror, the window did not shatter, but instead collapsed inward, my forward momentum pulling me down into the hazy shadows below. I cascaded down, further than I'd anticipated the cellar to be, and crashed hard onto an old wooden table, splintering it into two with the force of my impact. My head rang out, and my body cried in agony. I'd landed awkwardly on my wrist and felt a sharp snapping as my weight collapsed on top of it. I tried desperately to subdue my cries of pain, but to no avail. Surely the reverend had heard the clatter and would find himself upon me any minute. The thought of being discovered by the wretched holy man fueled my body with an adrenal intensity, forcing me to my feet and to stagger my way toward any kind of exit. Feeling around in the murk, I eventually came upon a thick iron door. I leaned against the cold metal and tried to catch my breath before continuing, only to be met with a sound that set my teeth on edge. The sound of a woman's soft sobbing. I listened intently for a moment, and yes, I could clearly hear a quiet whimper coming from the room beyond the thick metal door. I felt around blindly for a handle and pulled hard. The door rattled noisily in its frame. It had been barred from the outside. Fumbling frantically, I removed the heavy wooden door jamb and pulled once more. The hinges groaned in protest before giving away, and the heavy metal cried awfully as it slid against the old stone floor. I'd completely forgotten about being noiseless, and was almost entranced by the weeping woman. When the door was open wide enough for me to fit through, I slipped inside and felt my stomach drop with such force that I had to lean back on the frame to steady myself. The room was dimly lit by a lantern sitting on a table to my immediate left. The surface was also riddled with glass phials of varying sizes, each containing different liquids. In the dull light I could see that most appeared thick and viscous, and no two were the same color. There were surgical utensils as well, rusted scalpels, blades, and hypodermic needles making up most of them. There were books opened at seemingly random pages, depicting intricate and complicated-looking formulae. In the center of the room, a large medical table was covered in sheets that were stained with what appeared to be large, dark splotches. The floor surrounding the table was spattered with dried blood. Beyond the table, bound by large shackles at her wrists and ankles, was a young woman, a teenager. Her auburn hair hung down into her face and looked as though it hadn't been cut in years. She was wearing a dingy nightgown that I was sure had been white long ago, but had now been ruined with grime, sweat, and other bodily filth. Her skin had been rubbed raw where the shackles gripped her, indicating that she'd been imprisoned here for quite some time. The exposed flesh looked sickly and infected, dotted by small pustules that seemed to weep a foul ichor if she moved too rapidly. As her head drifted wearily to her left side, I could see a distinct and fresh wound that turned my blood to ice. Between her breast and collarbone was a deep, circular lesion surrounded by blackening, bruised flesh. This girl had been the victim of a gunshot. I swallowed hard and the girl looked up at me. Her eyes were sunken. Small trails of blood trickled from her tear ducts. Her pupils had collapsed, giving her eyes an inhuman and animalistic look, only accented by the bulging blood vessels in her sclera. The pale skin of her face seemed to be stretched thin over her skull. She looked like she hadn't eaten a decent meal in weeks. I expected her to be relieved that seeing someone who could help would start her begging me to free her, but she only glared at me with a feral intensity. When I reached out to her and tried to speak, she flew into a rage and began screaming an unholy, awful sound. She flailed her arms and kicked her legs, rattling her chains violently. I felt my knees go weak and found myself crawling backwards on the floor in abject horror. Her frenzied cries and wild behavior was made 1,000,000 times worse by the fact that her bonds seemed to be giving away, if ever so slightly. I began to scramble for the door. I wanted nothing more than to leave that cursed place, that horrible young woman, and be home, safe in my bed. But as I grabbed for the handle, the door flew back against me, knocking me onto my back. Reverend Dutoit had burst into the room, his dry, ancient voice now booming through the stone room. At the sight of me, however, his shouts died in his throat. His pale grey eyes grew wide with panic, and his already pale skin became that much more paled as the blood rushed from his face. "You!" The question croaked out of his throat as he extended a long, skeletal finger in my direction. "You cannot," he said more firmly, though the mask of confusion never left his wrinkled face. We stared at each other for a long time. All the while the chain girl continued her caterwauling. "Her name," he whispered solemnly, with eyes sinking to the stone floor beneath him. "Her name is Koleta. She is my daughter. I know she hurt that young boy," he said, pausing. "He was not the first. I know she would have hurt you as well had you not fired on her." The man raised his gaze to stare at the auburn-haired girl, and tears welled in his aged eyes. "She doesn't mean to hurt, my Koleta," he said. "She's sick, you see. Plague runs in her blood. Cursed she is. I've tried for years to help her to take the sickness away, but with every blood moon, she gets harder and harder to control." The man slowly removed an overcoat, again revealing his bandaged arm, and winced noticeably as he undid the wrapping. His arm had been gouged in 3 deep, rough slashes that could only have been made by very sharp teeth or claws. The wounds oozed a trail of milky pus as he moved. They were clearly infected, and judging by the tentacling black veins beneath his thin skin, I didn't think he had much of a chance of surviving. Dutoit stepped over me, his long legs swinging silently as he did, and made his way to the chained, wild form of Koleta. She screamed and roared at him, gnashing her teeth and sending a spray of spittle across her father's face. He cupped her cheek, being careful not to lose a finger in the process, and started humming softly to her. It was a tune I recognized vaguely, though to place it proved impossible. Koleta's fit steadily calmed as he sang, until her head drooped low and her body relaxed. He kissed her softly on the forehead and whispered something indistinct into her ear. After wiping the tears from his eyes, he turned again to face me. He walked softly toward me and extended a hand to help me from the floor. "Come," he said. "Let me make you some tea and we can get you back to your parents, no worse for wear." With that, he strolled calmly past me and into the cellar beyond. I did not follow. I reached out to the warped work table and firmly grasped a jagged, rusty scalpel. The Reverend stopped just beyond the large iron door, and a cold stillness engulfed the air between us. I saw him draw in a shuddering breath and quietly plead, "Don't." My blood burned hot as it pumped powerfully through my veins. I knew what I had to do. I'd come here to confront the thing that killed Kaelin. And here she was, bound and waiting, being protected by only a frail old man. Time seemed to slow, and I pivoted on my heels, breaking for the dog thing this man called Koleta. The Reverend barely had time to turn around before I cleared the distance and drew the blade across the girl's throat. Dutois' screams echoed around me and almost seemed to drown out the sound of a single gunshot. Shocked, I looked back at the ancient man as my brain tried to make sense of what had happened. He stood in the doorway, tears pouring down his face. In his left hand was an old flintlock pistol, smoke dancing eerily from the barrel, a barrel which had been pointed straight at me. I looked down and saw a steady stream of beautiful crimson pouring from my abdomen. I returned my gaze to the Reverend before collapsing to the floor. My body felt cold as the life began to drain from me. There wasn't any pain, just a rapidly encroaching chill, unlike anything I'd ever felt before. My vision seemed to tunnel in on itself until I locked eyes with the fading light of Koleta. There was little expression to be gleaned from those amber pearls, but I thought I could detect a kind of peace in those inhuman, collapsed pupils of hers. As the darkness closed around me, I swore I saw the faintest hint of a contented smile across her lips. I don't know exactly what transpired after I'd lost consciousness. When I woke up the next day in the town surgery, people didn't want to say much and mostly just told me to rest. From what I was able to drag out of a nurse and a few others that had stopped in to check on me, Dutois' gunshot and screaming had drawn the attention of a local vendor who was attempting to call on the Reverend, which had sent him running into town and raising an alarm with anyone he could find. Townsfolk stormed the house and discovered Dutois cradling the now freed body of Koleta, and had found me bleeding out on the floor. When they tried to pry him off the girl's body, he fought back violently with the same scalpel I'd used to rend her throat. In the ensuing struggle, Dutois was overpowered and killed. His mournful cries, I was told, echoed in each man's head like a dying curse before he finally succumbed to his wounds. The house and all traces of its unholy secret were burned to the ground after that. People asked me what business I had in that house, why the Reverend saw fit to end my life. But I said nothing. My silence was chalked up to shock brought on by the traumatic experience. No one questioned me about the girl with the open hair. She was just treated as an unspoken detail, and that was all there was to it. As for me, the bullet had done minimal damage. The surgeon said that the shot was 1 in a million, missing vital organs and sparing me from nerve and spinal damage. I made a full recovery in time, though when it rains or when I stop to think about it too much, the old wound cries out, refusing to be forgotten. I still think about Kaelin, of course. It pains me to know he'll never get to grow up. Instead, I try to live my life in honor of the boy. I spend as much time as I can trying new things, even those that frighten me, because I know Kaelin will never get to. I can cherish the memories for the both of us. I still don't fully understand the reasons behind what happened, and perhaps it's better that way. The thing that took him away from me was gone, burned to ash and buried beneath a mound of rubble, destined to be forgotten. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud, I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.